just want to say thanks for everyone for joining us today for our fifth session in our Parent Lunch and Learn series. So today we're going to be covering and exploring the very important topic of when grief is complicated. And so before we get going today, just wanting to extend a welcome to those of us who have been here before, and also to those who are joining our Parent Lunch and Learn series for the first time. I can provide a bit of info around our format today. So firstly, I know you saw when you entered today that our sessions are recorded and they will be posted to our website, so you can revisit them. You can send them to folks who you think might benefit from them. We are aiming to have a 10 to 15 minute Q&A portion at the end of our time together today. We're going to do our best to have that much time. This is a big topic, so there's a lot to cover. The Q&A portion isn't posted to our website when we do post the video there when it's uploaded. So if there's any hesitancy around hopping on because of that, it won't be posted to the website. And we are going to wrap up at 1 o'clock. We honor your time and know that sometimes this fits into a busy day. So we'll wrap up at 1 as well. I'm going to be posting the link to our website in the chat later on. So if you're wanting to come back to this recording, you'll know where to find it. I'll post that link. And if you have any questions come up today throughout the presentation that you're not wanting to hold till the end, please feel free to jump on the chat and put it in there. I'll be in the chat. I'll be answering questions there. If I see themes coming up in the chat as well, I'll jump in and maybe interrupt Shanna as she's presenting our content today too, to bring those questions forward. And you can also direct message me. If you're not wanting to bring a question into the public chat, you can direct message me and I can bring it forward. And something else that we invite, that we know that this is a lot of information in one session. And so if later on today or tomorrow you're thinking about today's session and you have a question, please email us. I'll as well put our general kind of information email in the chat as well, and you can reach out to us that way. That covers most of our housekeeping items for today. And one more item we're wanting to cover before we launch into today's session is to let you guys know about this upcoming important day. So November 18th is Children's Grief Awareness Day. It's an international movement that's also locally recognized, and it was created with the intention to let children and youth who are grieving know that they're not alone. There's a lot of different ways that we can mark the day. You can go to our website and it has information about the day, ways that you can connect, and then also ways that you can honor the day for your family. So there's a lot of different things happening in and around our city. The Calgary Public Library has a list of books to mark Children's Grief Awareness Day. You can also add a photo frame to your Facebook photo. You can also see landmarks around our city are going to be lit up for the day. The Calgary Tower, Olympic Plaza, Arts Commons, Telus Spark. So we invite you to, you can take a photo in front of those landmarks, upload it to social media. You can also create a luminary in memory of, a special person in your life or in that of your children's lives who has died, and light up the luminary on the evening of November 18th. We do have kits here at the center that you can reach out and let us know if you'd like one. You can come and pick one up and create those luminaries with your families. And lastly, you can wear blue on the day to honor and acknowledge the day. We have information on our website about Children's Grief Awareness Day, so I'll also add that link into the chat today as well. So I'm wanting to now turn it over to Shanna, who will be presenting on this topic today. And before coming into grief work, Shanna worked for 12 years in the area of trauma. And so this is an area where Shanna holds a lot of knowledge and a lot of passion as well. And the intersections between these two pieces are particularly important. So thank you, Shanna, for leading us through this. And I invite you to launch us into this presentation today.
Thanks, Sophie. That was a very well done intro. I'm going to take notes for the next session that I'm introing. That was great. I'm going to move us on here and kind of get us going. Grief, it can be complicated. That's the title of our session today. And I want to start us off with just a few, notes to hold as we're having this conversation. The first one is that I recognize this is a huge topic, and that in this short hour that we're together, it's really not going to be possible for me to cover all of the diversity that's on this chat around the type of loss that you've had, your experiences, um, for you, for your child, in my life. Like, there's just so much texture and variation and color that 1 hour would never be able to capture. And so just know that the hope is just to give you a little bit of information around, as Sophie said, this intersection, the way that trauma and grief collide. It can be very tricky. And so just a little bit of information back to this slide here, how we want grief to work, A to B or A to Z, and how it actually works. This is grief generally. And then when you have some complex parts of the grief, maybe the type of the loss, the relationship with the person who died, some of those pieces that we're going to talk about today can add some extra knots, some extra tangles in this sort of ball of grief. It's a twofold challenge. People who have experienced some trauma in the death or in their loss, both have to grieve the death and also have to work with the trauma. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. And again, I'm happy to see a couple chats going up. I don't know if that's Sophie or that's other people, but want to invite just ongoing conversation throughout. Please feel free to put your question in, as Sophie said. I have a little Post-it here on my computer that says go slow. Because one of the really important parts when we're tending grief, period, but when we're tending complex parts of our grief or trauma, is to go slow. So I have a lot I want to offer you today, but I also want to go slow. And so I want to invite you to catch the pieces that you need to grab today. You do not have to remember all of this. I guess it's recorded and it's there if you want to come back to it, but also just to find the parts that resonate for you and that, are just some key pieces that you're going to hold on to or keep thinking about or have some questions about. So I think those are the main things, because this can be a really tough topic and a lot of you are likely living in this experience with your grief. Want to invite you to take care of yourself. Whatever that means for you. Maybe it means you've got a cup of coffee or tea nearby. You are listening as you walk. Sometimes I've done that. I turn off the video and listen and walk, get movement. And also, if this is more than you bargained for in your lunch hour, please feel free to pop off and come back to it at a later point. Two things as we begin. I want to talk about this word complicated. I just want to be clear that the way that I'm using it today is really just to acknowledge how grief is complex and that there are some pieces that make it, that present additional challenges that can make it more complex, that add to some of those tangles and knots. I'm not using this in sort of a diagnostic way. If you've heard that, there's some people who there's diagnosis out there about complicated grief or persistent bereavement. And that's not the way in which I'm using that. I think at the Children's Grief Center, it's fair to say that as an agency, we hold the belief that, again, like I said, so many variations. You don't have to tick certain boxes, and you don't even have to own the trauma label to say your grief is really complex. And so just want to clarify that, the way that I'm using that word today. And then lastly, I want to tell you how I come into this conversation, which is I helped launch these lunch and learns, and I'm a presence each session here, and I love being a part of this community. This topic is personal for me. I come into the conversation around trauma and grief because in 2003, my beloved, beautiful, creative, loyal, athletic brother died of a drug overdose. And so began my own journey, complicated journey, on this path of grieving and making sense of the loss and some of the things we're going to talk about today. So just want to acknowledge that as we come into it. I'm going to take a deep breath because here we go, kind of a deep dive into this topic around trauma and grief. As we start, I want to acknowledge, I think there's a myth out there that a traumatic event equals people are traumatized. And we know and acknowledge that's not always the case. So there can be a traumatic death that does not land as trauma in a person's life or body, a grief. And the flip side is also true. It can look like a pretty non-traumatic death, and that can land as trauma for a person. So I just want to kind of clear that space as we go forward. It's not necessarily the nature of a death that makes it traumatic. It's how a person experiences it and perceives that, how it lands for them. A lot of personal factors have a lot to do with this. What's the level of stress when the death occurs? What is a person's coping style before a death? What are the skills around navigating big emotions prior to sort of being immersed in this sea of grief? What are the supports around you or your people? Some of these pieces, is there trauma that occurred prior? Are there other losses that have happened? Is this a layer of loss? So there's quite a few factors that can impact how it lands. So just want to acknowledge that together. So if you're thinking either way, like, oh, our death wasn't traumatic, there can still be some of these pieces that are real and present for you, and vice versa. So just want to acknowledge that. And just this is a very short hour, but I just want to give us a working definition of what I'm talking about when I mean trauma. It's an overused word in our society. We refer to all kinds of things as traumatizing, and I think that because of that, sometimes it loses its impact. And if you're living with trauma in your life, I think you know that. So just want to offer us this very simple definition that Dan Siegel kind of boiled down for us, which is the simplest way of defining trauma is to understand that it's an experience that we have that overwhelms our capacity to cope. So simply said, I'll just kind of expand off of Dan's simple explanation, but that is, trauma is not what happens to us, it's what happens inside of us, in us, as a result of what's happening. So it's not necessarily the event, it's our internal response, our perceptions of what's happening, that interpretation, and our own experience based on all the things I just said in the last slide. So I want to highlight that because as we go forward and we talk about how to support your kids, I want to highlight that what trauma does, when trauma lands in the body because of an experience we're having and we're out of capacity, it's just too much. It's flooding, it overwhelms our ability to cope, our skills to cope. What that does is it disconnects us from ourselves, and it disconnects us from people in our world and often beliefs that have held the ground for us in this time where everything feels like it's moving and we really are looking for solid ground. So I think just recognizing that as we go forward and we talk about how to connect and support, one of the key pieces here is that it is hard to stay in the present moment when you have experienced trauma. The disconnection is part of the protection because it is too overwhelming. And so this is how we're going to kind of hold and understand the idea of trauma, this word trauma that we're using today. And I hope that kind of helps put it in a frame for us. The other thing that's going to run through this conversation is the concept of a puzzle. I like to talk with kids that putting together, understanding their grief, making sense of it, sharing their experience of grief can sometimes be a little bit like putting together a puzzle. And sometimes the pieces it's clear where they go, and sometimes it's not. And with a traumatic death or a traumatic loss, a sudden loss, sometimes this is even a more fitting metaphor, the puzzle metaphor, because there are pieces that don't necessarily fit. There are missing pieces to this puzzle. Pardon me, there's missing pieces to this puzzle. And so as we talk about it today, we're just going to talk about how to put the pieces of this puzzle together for you, for your family, for your kids. What are the keys? And what are the ways that trauma makes this a little bit harder? So if you've attended any of the past sessions, some of this is going to sound familiar, but I just wanted to boil it down that if there's a lot of info today. If you're just thinking about these three things, just hold this frame. What do we want to do? We want to provide kids, young people with the facts of the death. And we have an entire session on that Nadine did, talking to kids about death and grief. And so I think I want to say that's session 2 or 3. And so check that out because there's some real specifics around how to do that. But, just in a situation where there is a traumatic loss, you don't have to give every detail. You can limit details and focus on the impact for your child, and you can follow the lead of their questions. But they do need some facts, some information as they begin to put this puzzle together to try to make sense of what's happened. The second piece here, we're going to talk a little bit more about today, but supporting yourself and your kids to explore the feelings and thoughts related to their grief. I know that sounds simple, like, yeah, okay, I know this is what we're doing, but it's actually key for a lot of reasons that we're going to get into specifically as it relates to trauma. And then this third piece, which is to support them and empower them to decide if they're going to keep or release the person who's died from the club of their life. And our next session, which is about sort of staying connected to the person who died, we're going to spend more time on this, but these three pieces are essential parts of putting together this puzzle of grief as kids are exploring and making sense and learning to share about their grief, their loss, their person. I think I just want to highlight one of the pieces around providing them with the facts of the death is that when we do that, we are building trust and we are creating some sense of safety. And so that's the developmentally appropriate facts, not using euphemistic words like they've passed away or they were sick if it was suicide, for example, or a drug overdose, finding appropriate language for their level of understanding, but it's truthful, factual. And I am really thrilled to share a parent story with you later in the session, toward the end of the session. And Des is going to speak about how valuable that is for kids to begin to put those puzzle pieces together and to be able to turn toward life in new ways, which is what we're all wanting for your kids. When it comes to supporting kids and exploring feelings, I just wanted to, we're going to come back to this at the end. I'm going to give you some fun ideas about how to do this. But, Sophie shared recently a client where the mom had said, my kid hates, the worst question is when, I ask, what are you feeling or how are you feeling today? And so coming up with some more creative ways to check in with each other and to learn to share, identify what's going on inside, what's going on in our emotions are in our body. And so being able to link to that is key to being able to then come in and support it, to support the trauma that's occurred in the body. We're going to talk, I keep saying that, we're going to talk about that later. So let's move on. We'll move forward and keep going. I want to honor some of these really unique parts of trauma and grief. I'm sure we could add more to the list, and feel free to in the chat if other parts are coming up for you. But one of a predominant piece is that memories often are feeling trailed or reshaped by pain in where there is a complicated death or a traumatic death. And this includes when, as I had mentioned before, when the relationship with the person might have unfinished business, you have unfinished business between you, or maybe there was conflict or estrangement. So this isn't just that the nature of the death is sudden or traumatic, but that the nature of the relationship is also complicated. And so sometimes in grief, these memories, it's hard for them to ever feel the comfort that you hope for. They're trailed by pain. They feel reshaped by pain. And I want to acknowledge that this may not always be the case for kids. So sometimes what is trailed by pain for us is still a well of joy for them, because kids at this stage of development, the way they hold the past and the future is different, just their brain structure, their development. And so whereas adults are typically grieving the past and the future that will not be, kids are often more in this present moment. And so I've seen that a lot, where a child is sharing a memory that actually brings them a lot of joy, but for a parent is trailed by pain. And there's nothing wrong with either thing. It's just something to be aware of, that this is sometimes a unique piece. I want to talk really briefly. We could do a week session on trauma and grief, but just really briefly, just to say, I've already kind of said trauma is what happens in us. Trauma is experienced in our body and it gets held in our body. And when it does overwhelm our ability to cope and lands as trauma, our body systems become disrupted. I probably don't need to tell any of you this. Grief disrupts our body as well, our sleep, our eating, all of these pieces. But there is kind of a unique component here around how our system gets disrupted and can't come back to baseline, kind of gets stuck. And so to try to protect us, what our brains are doing, they link together danger with sensations in our body, feelings in our body, and memory. So that will always show up in something you see or hear, or it will always come through the senses, I guess is what I want you to know, in the body. And this matters because when we want to tend this, we have to go in the body to tend it before we start doing a lot of thinking or processing or meaning making about things. So Sophie and I were chatting about this right before we came on, and she had a great example, which was that our brain knows it's better to mistake a stick for a snake and be wrong than think that the snake is a stick. Like this lower level of our brain, that's not this part of us who shows up as a functioning adult, but just this reactionary part of our brain that's developed to keep us safe, that isn't actually totally connected to some of these thinking parts. It's there to keep us safe. And when you've had a traumatic experience, your body's linking those in order to protect you the next time around. And so what can happen is that alarm system that's there to protect us can sort of get tripped. The wires are like getting tripped a little bit, and they can get set off when there isn't actual danger. And I also wanted to highlight, sometimes that looks like, we're paying attention a lot and that we're sort of activated. And sometimes it actually looks like we are numb. It can be, it's just back to this variation. And so I don't want to be too prescriptive about this if you're checking in on your own experience or your kids' experience. And so those are both ways trying to protect us, but it can get stuck and then start to impact our functioning. And I wanted just to give you a few examples about some of the ways that you might experience, or people are experiencing, kids I've worked with are experiencing this link. And the way that it's showing up. Often people will describe it as like a panic attack. But if we kind of go back, we can see that there was an input, there was a sense, there was something they saw or smelt or felt, tasted, heard, that then triggered that anxiety and that reaction and that fear, that sense of threat. And the challenge is that it's not always linked to a fact right now. With trauma, the past is now. Time is you're not actually necessarily in this moment. Your brain is kind of combining the two for you. It's overlaying the past moment and this moment, and it feels like you are under threat in this moment. So I was thinking about that can be, and again, feel free to add your own experience into the chat of this if you've had this, but I'm thinking so many variations here. Like, I think there's the things that we can expect and predict. And then there's the things that catch us totally off guard, like a picture that pops up on our phone. I'm thinking of, young people I've worked with, a picture that pops up on their phone during lunch and takes them right back. Making a favorite meal. These don't always have to be bad things that signal to our brain. Sometimes it can be happy memories that used to be happy, or you're eating chili and that was your person's favorite thing, and the smell of the chili, or pieces like that. But also things like that there's a connection, but it's not a direct link, but your brain has made a link. Brake lights that shine through a window that your brain sees as the fire that maybe swept over your house. A text message or a phone call, and maybe that's how you were notified of a sudden death. And so now every time the phone rings or every time there's a text message, and you go to worst case scenario. I've had clients who it's even just like the smell of an energy drink. Our brains are very brilliant in trying to protect us, and it doesn't always make sense. And so this is that piece around we're going to attune to what is going on right now in this moment instead of trying to understand why this is happening. And we're going to try to create safety in this moment so that our alarm system, those alarm bells, can quiet down. And then we can kind of make some different decisions. Obviously, we want to scan, is there safety here? If there is safety, then we can kind of shift gears. I want to pause really quick and back to my post-it of slowing down. How are people doing? So Sophie, you have the chat. I can't see the chat. Is this making sense? Do people have questions? Are you having?
No questions have come up in the chat so far. It's open.
Quiet group.
We're listening and receiving, okay. I think.
Okay. I think one other piece I want to offer as we talk about how to support our bodies, our kids, when this sort of panic arises or this trauma response comes up, it feels huge. It feels scary. It feels too big. And I think sometimes we think our practice, our grounding, however we intervene, also has to be equally as big. And that's not totally the case. We can find small, simple ways to bring safety to our body, sort of ground us back into our body. And I mean, first of all, we can just acknowledge that we're feeling panicked. Like there's, first of all, just acknowledging what's happening in the body. Wow, my hands are tingling. Becoming aware of how your body is communicating for you. And then there may just be practices that work for you. We're all really different. So for some people, back to how you're going to do this, you're going to do it through your senses, the sights, sounds, smells, touch, taste. And it might be a scent, it might be a song, it might be a walk, it might be cleaning, it might be, there can be a variety of ways that you bring your body kind of back into this present moment. But as I already mentioned, the present moment is really hard when trauma is part of the story. And so really what we're thinking about is how do we create safety in this moment? How do we enlarge our capacity to stay here in this moment when it feels too much? I also want to say you have permission to mindfully check out of this present moment. Sometimes this present moment is actually too much. And then we recognize that. Actually, no, I'm going to go get a burger. It's just that I just gave myself away that's one of my go-tos, I'm just going to go eat a burger, some fries, or you distract. And that is okay too, because what we're going to do is we're going to move between. We're going to move. That's how we create safety. We're moving between our body's experience of overwhelm and stress and safety and meaning making. This is a movement. So I just wanted to highlight some of these are part of grief that isn't complex, but a lot of these are consistent parts of more complex grief stories. So if there's a traumatic loss, sudden death, maybe the death is at the hands of another person, suicide, overdose, these kinds of death, guilt and regret can often play a really prominent role and for a long time, actually. Shock and trouble sort of integrating the reality of the loss is a part of grief. And when there are these traumatic aspects to the loss, our body tries to protect us. These might linger. They may not, but they might linger. Blame. Trying to understand, blame can kind of get shifted around all over the place. Sometimes there is a preoccupation with like, why? Back to the root, like, why did this happen? How did this happen? How did I miss this? These are normal. So these are not problems. These are normal parts of grief when you've had a difficult death, a traumatic loss. Sometimes there is real shame and stigma around the type of death. So my brother died almost 20 years ago. And at that time, overdose deaths were not talked about quite in the way that they are now. There's a lot of shame around that. It felt very stigmatized. And back to one of the other pieces down here, it says not sharing the cause of death. That led us to sort of keep that private for a long, long time. Really I think we hoped to protect him, protect our person. We didn't want people to judge him based on this one piece of the story that they knew about him. And I don't think I have it on this list, but another piece is that sometimes the trauma pieces can come to the front of the story and sort of feel like the final stamp over a person's life. And sometimes some of these pieces are protest against that and push back against that. So anyway, just want to kind of highlight these, if these are part of your experience, your kids' experience. It is important for us, back to kind of supporting them with their emotions and their exploration, give them a sense of what they might expect, or when these things arise, to normalize it, validate it. They're not doing anything wrong, that these are coming up as part of this loss. So rage, sometimes a sense of relief if it's been a long journey with mental health or addiction, complicated relationship with a person where contact with them has been painful or not consistent. Sometimes there's also a feeling of relief. And I want to say, and like also, like all of these, this is not an either or. Not sharing cause of the death, and intense distress, right? That has trouble kind of settling down, that it peaks and it stays. And as I already mentioned, sometimes that can also look like numbness, where our body shuts down to protect us from that overwhelm. Increased suicidal thoughts or self-destructive behaviors. And sometimes for some people, it looks like activism, that they set out to try to right the wrong, or to spare other people, other families, the loss they've experienced, or even other people, the pain that their person has lived with, or that they're aware that their person was holding kind of up to their death. I think I also just want to acknowledge that that's a very real part when there's traumatic pieces to the death. If it's a suicide or an overdose, part of the pain is also looking back into the past and holding your person with the pain and the suffering that they were living with. And so I think it's an added hard part. Just want to acknowledge that. Coming back to all of us, but your kids in particular, so we're talking about trauma and grief more generally in the slides we've just gone through. But I've titled this one, whatever, I can't even actually see what I've titled it there. When the pieces won't fit. I was going to say don't fit. When the pieces won't fit. And these are some, I'm kind of, just to make it a little simpler. Of course I am simplifying, but these 4 areas can make tending grief harder if these pieces are part of your child's puzzle. And so this is chronic sorrow is what it's called. And it's really about when there has been chronic sorrow, when there's been a history of losses, or maybe I wrote previous challenges there, but maybe trauma in their history, in their past, but perhaps other challenges that have just made functioning and coping with difficult situations hard. Maybe their own personality. I mean, some kids have personalities that make being flexible, being resilient, being movable a little bit harder. There's their own temperament, personality, coping styles, all of that. Social connections for them too. So where there have been multiple losses or challenges that have made their pack, if you will, what they're carrying, heavier, even before the death occurred. So that's going to make it an added challenge. Where there is a lack of a sense of predictability or stability, because as grief comes into your world, it overwhelms. It's an overwhelming experience. And so you do need a little bit of stability, predictability, in order to feel safe enough to explore those feelings and the story of loss. And so actually, when people come to the center for counseling, if safety and security aren't in place first, that is where we begin. And so that's where you begin too with your child. And I think one of the cautions, I have 2 kids myself, and one of the cautions is that, we assume we know. what they need. And we might have some really good ideas because you know your kids better than anybody, but it's worth asking. It's worth checking in about what they're needing for a sense. And I want to highlight that, a felt sense of safety, pardon me, and security, because what that is what matters, is how it lands for them, what they perceive it to be, and not just what we think we're offering. And so just to check in on their sense of what they're needing for predictability, stability, to sort of begin to move into these deeper waters, or putting this puzzle piece together that is overwhelming as well. I've already highlighted this a few times, and I probably can't highlight it enough, that the relationship with the person who died will have an impact on the grief, and whether the grief is more traumatic. So I've listed here that if, it's been complicated, estranged, not enough consistent contact, unfinished business, then that can complicate it. We might have to spend a little more time in that part of the puzzle. Back to not making assumptions. I just wanted to share, I support a teenage guy whose mom died. And so she was murdered. And when you think about what might add to a traumatic loss, for my mind, I would think, okay, we have a possibility of this being traumatic for this young person. But the relationship with his mom was so strong and so marked by values that they shared. They actually had a fight before she died. And I honestly made an assumption that would probably land as part of the complexity to his grief. It was unfinished between them. They'd had this fight. He went away, she died, and there's no way to bridge that. And I remember asking him about it, what that was like. And he was just so easy, just replied to me, "Oh, no, it's fine. My mom forgave me always." And so I know what she would say to me, and he could just say what she would say, that there wasn't something she held on to. Their relationship just held that quality. And so though he has a lot of other pieces, he has chronic sorrow, he has safety and security, those are pieces that are a struggle in his life. The relationship was an anchor. And it was not a part of his puzzle that made things more difficult. So these, not making assumptions is helpful, and also looking for the places where your kid is being lifted up. They might have one or two of these, but there's other places that can sort of balance that out. The last one here that I just want to acknowledge is needing a story that makes sense. So when I showed you those 3 things that we're really thinking about when we're supporting kids in grief, the facts, supporting their exploration of their feelings and their thinking around their person in grief, and then what to do about staying connected or not to their person. This first one around the story, having a story that makes sense, just highlighting that this truthful information, when it's not available to a young person, really can add to what's hard. When the pieces can't be found. I also want to take a breath, and I want to acknowledge that this can be very weighty. Sometimes with a traumatic death, suicide, overdose, there's no goodbye, there's not closure. And so it makes it really hard to see empty parts of the puzzle. And so what do we do with that? Sometimes we try to make puzzle pieces that can fit good enough. So sometimes in therapy, that's what we're doing. Let's shape a piece. Let's take what we can and shape a piece. Let's hear about the story of their life from other people who knew them, so that we can, it's not going to be a perfect fit, but so that we can fill out this part of the puzzle. Sometimes you undertake knowing them in new ways. And sometimes it's just not enough. And so back to this theme that I hope I've been highlighting is tending the distress as it comes. Honoring that is hard, that it feels intolerable to not know, to not have a letter that helped you understand why they made a decision that they made, or even just not to have a goodbye. Sometimes we can recreate it after, sometimes we can't. And it's learning to tolerate this overwhelming, this is hard for adults, let alone children. noticing the time for us, I want to share. I don't know if Des is on. Des, are you on the call? Can you see that, Sophie? If Des is here?
I'm just taking a look.
Yeah.
I don't see Des's name in the participants right now.
Okay. So Desiree is a client at the Children's Grief Center, and she has been incredibly generous to share her story with this Parent Lunch and Learn community. So I just want to take about 15 minutes. And so I can actually see, we're going to have to come back to this topic. I was not wrong when I said this is big. And I think we will return to a part 2. But I want to offer you her story as a parent and some of the way that these things showed up in their family story. And you may find parts that fit for you, and you may, find where your own experience was different. But I just want to be able to share that. So let me go to that. And before I play it, I just want to introduce, so Des, I don't know what's, maybe she felt like she didn't actually want to come on today, but she gave a generous yes to this community to share her story. So her husband took his own life 3.5 years ago when their kids were 5 and 3. And this is just a snippet of our conversation, but some of the really beautiful things she articulates as a parent, like this is an ongoing conversation that will keep unraveling over time. We'll talk more about that in whatever comes of part 2 here. It might be next time. But also that she didn't do it perfectly, but she did do it skillfully. And so part of these Lunch and Learn sessions is to support you to be able to build your skills to do this. It doesn't have to be perfect. And we can return to these conversations. We can return to where we kind of get it wrong for our kids. And so I just want to share Des's voice with you as parents who are navigating, supporting your kids through a more complicated grief. I remember how important it was to you to know that your kids could always trust you.
Yeah.
Do you want to say anything more about that? Do you remember how powerful and important that was? Like to you as a mother,
Yeah.
it was very tender and raw.
Yeah. It still is. I just look at them and I think, of course, right? Like I'm a mom first, so I'm like, how could this happen to you? Like, I just want to take you to an island where no one can hurt you. I'll be there. I won't hurt you. And so I just always want them to trust me so that they always know that they have one place to come and feel safe, because psychological safety, by words of truth and being able to ask questions and not feel dumb, is mental health, and so I feel like, will they question themselves if I don't tell them the truth and they find out otherwise? There's some family history there where I've had to set some boundaries with people, and so I don't know, like, are those people going to come back in their life and say I said this, and I have emails and stuff, and I always want them to be like, you know what, no, doesn't sound like my mom, but I'm going to go ask her and she's going to be able to show me this or tell me this. I don't know, like, it's just, I feel like they're going to, like, there's psychological safety that that they know I have their back. I'll tell them, and I just often feel like I'm all they have. I know we have lots of really good, like a large family tree, but at the end of the day, I'm their mom. Like I'm their one last sort of person that they should be able to think, I'm gonna go ask my mom.
One of the stories that stands out to me that I remember that I think a lot of parents can connect to is Naya finds you in the closet and you're crying.
Yeah.
And you're trying to protect your girl. So you're in the closet and you're keeping this contained as much as you can.
Yeah.
And she, do you want to share that story instead of me?
Yeah, it still brings tears to my eyes because that's part of the guilt. Because they were concerned for me, you know, and you're like, no, don't be concerned for me. That's my job. It's my job to be concerned of you, take care of you. And of course, you know, kids do what you do. So she's rubbing me and what's wrong. And it was a bad moment. I was like fetal position on the floor, but I think because, you know, and through the counseling, they would say they have to see you cry. Like if you're crying, they have to see you cry. Like it's okay to be hurt, but I just couldn't cry. Like I don't know if they would say, "Do you miss Daddy?" And I want to be like, "No, I hate him. Like no, I don't miss him. No, I don't love him." And I would say, "Yeah, I do." You know, and I just didn't want to say that anymore. And I think all that stuff, I was doing things I didn't want to do, so it was like making me feel like gross and just I couldn't be me, and so all of that just came to a head. And so I lied to her at that time. I said I can't remember what I said I was crying about, but it comes back. All lies come back, and then I had to say, yeah, I was on you know, crying back then. I think it was probably a year when I had to tell her why. But I was able to tell her it was a lot of things. It was just everything. I was mad. I was mad that I have to do everything myself. I was mad that I can't give you everything you want because, you know, there's only one person works here, and all these things that I felt was so unfair to them because they shouldn't be hearing about that stuff at their age. But I also wanted to be truthful as to why I was crying. And so I had to tell her that, yeah, you know, you did catch me crying, and it was because I'm mad at him. I was mad at him. And it's okay if I'm mad at him, even though he's your daddy. And you can be mad at him, I said, even though you love him. You can love somebody and be so mad at them. And that's why I was crying, because I was so mad at him.
And I'm struck by, I remember your ability to begin to own that in your own experience and share it in an appropriate way with her, allowed her to also touch the feelings of anger that she also had. I remember another piece you had shared with her about being mad was like, I'm mad that you and your brother have to have this in your life, this pain, you know, this thing that you have to navigate. And I'll never forget how that opened something for her, which was,
it totally did.
I can be mad. I am mad at him, but I don't know how to be mad at this person I love, right? That was very confusing. And so when you began to be able to open yourself into that, she could too.
Yeah.
Parents are asking, how do I know that we're on the right track? How do I know that I'm supporting my kids in a way that's healthy for their grieving? Like what as you look back and as you're holding your kids even now, like, I don't know, how would you speak to that?
Yeah, this makes me tear up because I think what I equate it to is, you know, we're like, we tell our kids like the same thing 50 million times, and then a stranger or like your aunt and uncle or whatever, they're like, oh my God, your kids are so wonderful, they're so polite and everything, and you're like, my kids, they're a mess when they're around me or whatever. And so, you know, all the things that I would say, like all the supportive things, and you know, being age appropriately truthful with them, and taking the time to answer the questions. And I'm like, I think I may have asked you or Laura before. I'm like, will this end? Like, will this get better? Like, I just can't take it anymore. And I heard my kids, they were in the bath, and I had just stepped out into the hall to grab a towel, and I heard them whispering or whatever. And Naya, my daughter, tells my son, well, just ask mommy. You know, she tells us the truth. She always tells us the truth. And I'm like, and then I, you know, just bawled my face off. And I was like, okay, they're listening. I'm doing a good job. And just knowing that they know that, or they feel that, that was so important to me. So I was like, okay, that was like validation that I was on the right track. and then you just don't, it's just, I don't know, it's not a click or a day or a time. It's just, one day you're like, okay, okay.
Mm.
And then you have 5 shitty days and you're like, oh, I don't know if that really was a good day, but okay.
Mm.
And then you have another one. And then you believe it, you start believing in yourself that you can do it
Mhm.
because you do it every day.
Mhm.
And your kids, my kids used to write me notes like, I love you, mommy. You're so funny. Your favorite food is chips and wine, which is still true, but now it's like,
Mm.
you're so kind. You let me talk to you, like all these things. And at first I felt bad, and I'm like, no, this is how they're feeling. Like they feel like they can talk to me and tell me, or they're like, I know you're tired when I talk about daddy, but you still let me, or whatever, right? And I'm like, oh my God, that got me right in the heart with my guilt. But at least I let them, and they know that. And so those are the things that I found that I know when things are getting better, when they teach it back to me. They're saying the words I've used.
Mm.
And then, yeah, those normal things like, can I go for a sleepover, a play date? They're fighting, and they're not crying, and they're laughing, and they're having a good time, and like the sparkles back in their eye. Yeah. And like I said, it's not like you wake up and you're like, okay, whew, we're done that. But it's just a feeling, like it's just all of a sudden like it is just a stretch of happiness or good days, and they get longer and they get longer, more days stick together. But I will say, it's kind of like I get it. I did not want to say some things. I did not want to answer some questions, especially over and over again. And part of me thought, like, how is this helpful? Like, I was like, they keep telling me to talk about this. I'm like, this cannot be helpful. But it is, and it's almost like, okay, that topic or that question actually doesn't come up anymore because we have answered it as many times as it's needed to be. And then so you move on from that. Or once you've answered those hard questions, like that's what, like it is just like you need to step in it, face it, say it, and then it does calm down, or it goes away, those those pieces. But if you don't, like, that's one thing I learned, if you don't, then it will always be there, and then you will always have the feeling of, when is this going to end? Like, can I get a break? Yeah.
And with Naya, I'm just thinking about other kids as well. One of the things kids need is a story of the loss, a coherent story of the loss that makes sense to them. And so when you were giving her accurate information, and at different times she needed different information as she was creating a story that made sense to her. And as she got older, there were more questions. Well, why would he want to die on purpose? And so the story had to grow a little. The puzzle pieces, there were new ones to add. But I remember with Naya, and maybe you could speak to how this has continued on. One of the pieces, I think, when parents are like, are we on the right track? What do we need? Do we need support? Do we not? She was stuck on a few questions because she knew there was something she didn't know, and she didn't know how to ask the question. And so that's where she needed you to help her articulate the question, know what she was really kind of wondering. And one of the most beautiful parts of my career that I'll always carry forward with me is watching Naya and you have that very, very hard, beautiful, developmentally appropriate conversation where you shared, and you could just watch her mind putting the pieces in place of the missing, puzzle pieces about the story. And I think you had a lot of worries about, if I share this information, what does she do with it? How does it change things? Because kids are having to spend so much energy making sense of the story of loss on their own, or if they have these questions, to be able to watch Naya change. As she could turn her energy into life again. Cheer and school and friend problems, normal problems, you know,
Yeah,
like
yeah,
just
yeah.
the normal everyday stuff. Did you notice that? Like,
Oh
I'll
my
never
gosh.
forget that.
Yeah, it was night and day, right? And that's again where you got to put yourself on the back burner and do it for your kids so that they can move forward and they can live again. She was in a you know, a dark space or stuck for sure. Like she just wasn't herself, and then that was worrying me. But she needed to have those answers. Knowing that she needed the answers to those questions was the push for me to say those hard things. And then yeah, the change in her has been like wonderful.
To turn toward life, to grow larger, back to where we started.
Yeah, she's so much happier and um and uh and just happier.
And like, I don't know what stands out in your own experience that you really just want to offer that was supportive for you.
It going through this was super isolating for me. I always felt like no one understands and no one gets it. But like there are people out there who do understand. You seek help. You know, and I joke and I'm like, I've never been through this before. It's my first time, but you know, I don't have all the answers. So, you know, it's already hard enough to be a parent, never mind with grief. And it's long days, you know, your kids need you just in general. Like I look at how hard being a parent is just in general and then having this added. And so um just you're not alone, seek help and you know, take a break. Take time for yourself is so important because you want to be a good person, a good mom or a good dad, you know, whichever position you're in. And that's okay, like knowing that that's okay, don't feel guilty. I always say get yourself 2 great babysitters so you have a backup. And I will also say sometimes paid help is way better than a family member because they don't come with unsolicited advice and just, you know, and believe in yourself that you're doing the right thing no matter what anybody says. You are living it, you're there with your kids, not anyone else. And so you know what's right and just, you know, trust yourself, believe in yourself that you are, because that was taken away from me in the beginning. I didn't, you know, really trust or believe in myself in the beginning, but you know, every day you just get that back because you see all the things you are doing, even though they suck or it's so hard, are the right things. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, I honored my post-it, go slow, which means we've sort of run out of time yet again. But I really just knowing I probably had a little bit of extra to cover. I wanted to be sure and share Dez's story with you. I'm so grateful to her for, you know, often you guys come on these lunch and learns and we're talking about specifically how to support your kids. And I just love that she was willing to share it from a parent perspective, what it feels like and how to go back and correct when we don't quite get it right and that it takes time. You know, you didn't get to hear that part of her story, but it's not like it was all delivered, you know, in the first 2 weeks. You know, it took about 2 years to deliver kind of all of the pieces of information. And so that's just one snippet of our story. I know we're at 1 o'clock. So what I'm committed to is to come back to this topic, to come back to go even a little bit deeper. And maybe there's not a lot left, you know, there's maybe 15 more minutes maybe of information I'd like to share with you. And in addition to some strategies around how to support your kids with those 3 tasks, right? Like sharing the story of loss. Again, you can check out our the Lunch and Learn that talks about how to talk about death and grief. That will be amazing for that. And then exploring the emotions and supporting trauma in the body and all of those pieces. We'll come back to that. And next session, which is continuing bonds, we will kind of touch on the third one, which is what to do with the bond with the person. You know, you can choose to nurture it and carry it forward, or you can release it, and kids can release it. And that's all for now. You can change your mind at any time. And so we will return to this. In a way, I feel I'm sorry that, you know, we didn't cover the whole piece, but Sophie, before people go, I just want to check in on the chat. I don't know if the liveliness needs to be kind of honored. I didn't want to click on it and mess anything up.
We had a quiet chat today. No questions coming up throughout the way. We had some technical things we worked through together.
Okay.
We're getting some thank yous. So thank you,
Okay,
Shanna.
before you go, we're just gonna just check in with you. Sophie, would you just put up that poll? This is just a check-in, like what's something you're taking away from today? It might be that we didn't get, you know, to everything you were hoping for, and invite you to register for the future Lunch and Learns, and can tell you that the next one is the bonds, continuing the bonds or releasing bonds. Then right before Christmas, we'll do when the holidays hurt and what it's like to navigate the holidays with grief. And then in the new year, we will return to this conversation. We'll be back together. So
People are just filling out that poll. We'll give
thanks.
folks 10, 15 more seconds to get in there and
Yeah.
let us know what they're taking away from today. Thanks for everyone who's participated. And I'll show people.
Yeah.
Here we
Thanks.
go, our results here.
Here's the company you're in.
Mhm.
Some of the takeaways. Yeah. And the building safety with small practices. Yeah, it makes sense that, you know, we just didn't get to that completely today, and we will return to that. It's a beautiful key kind of part of supporting your kids. And so have a whole session on that probably. So thank you. Okay, I know we're at our time, folks. It's 1:03. Thanks for being a part of this online community of parents, especially in the time of COVID. I know we're coming out of that, but it's been, you know, additionally isolating. I would love to be able to, you know, have people in for a coffee and cookies and connect together, and hopefully in the future.